Hello, and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality. This podcast is part of GreenDeal-NET, a Jana Gheuens network that brings together research and teaching on EU climate and sustainability governance. I'm your host Jana Gheuens, and today we are going to look a little bit deeper into the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. It's a new and even innovative instrument that the EU has implemented as part of the European Green Deal in an attempt to export its climate policies abroad. We have already talked a little bit about this in episode 9 with Peter Vis on carbon prices, but because it's such a new, innovative and important measure, I thought it would be nice to dedicate an entire episode to it and just focus completely on what it does, all the details, how it influences other countries and so forth. Of course, I'm not doing this by myself, but I'm joined today by another great guest, Otto, a researcher at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels here in Brussels, who has recently also published a paper on the topic, which will be linked in the show notes. Hi Simon, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So to start, can you tell us a little bit more about what this Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is and how it works?
Of course, sure. So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM as it's commonly abbreviated, is a new EU policy that aims to prevent carbon leakage. Carbon leakage occurs when companies are subject to stringent climate policies, but because they want to avoid that, they move to another country where you don't have climate policies. For example, if a company is subject to a very strong carbon price, as in the EU, they might consider moving production elsewhere. This will help the emissions in the EU go down because the company doesn't produce here anymore, but it doesn't really help climate change globally because the emissions will just be done elsewhere. So to prevent this, the EU in the past has basically just exempted heavy industry or energy-intensive industries from its carbon price by giving them free allowances. So these companies didn't have to pay the carbon price at the same level as other companies had to do. This avoids them leaving the EU, but it also really doesn't incentivize them to reduce their emissions because they do not really have to pay a carbon price. And this is now where the CBAM comes in. The CBAM implements a carbon price on the imports of emission-intensive goods to the European Union, while at the same time phasing out the free allowances for these goods in the EU. And specifically, it applies to iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminum, hydrogen, and electricity. So from next year onwards, importers of these goods will have to pay a carbon price that equals the carbon price under the EU ETS, the emissions trading system. However, to avoid that it's really a price shock in the beginning, this price will only be phased in gradually between 2026 until 2034, when the full price will hit in sort of a parallel phase out to the free allowances, which will go down accordingly over the time. So the effect of this is that now domestic production and imports will be subject to the same carbon price on the EU market, leveling the playing field between domestic and international production. And this will then prevent carbon leakage in the future while incentivizing decarbonisation of all goods sold on the European market falling under these sectors. So on the one hand, it's really helping to advance EU climate policy and climate action domestically. On the other hand, by also pricing imports, so production outside the EU, it will also incentivize emissions reductions outside of the EU.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite interesting, the last point that you mentioned, that it's both an internal and an external measure. External because people or companies abroad will have to do it, but also internal because it kind of corrects this failure design flaw in the system that then encourages domestic producers to also actually reduce their emissions, which is of course what we need in the EU climate transition. So thanks a lot for that. Then when we think about what power does the EU actually have to kind of make these external companies adhere to these standards, what is behind the reasoning there?
I think that's an excellent question. One of the main powers the EU has is its large economic markets. The EU single market is one of the biggest markets globally, so it's very attractive for foreign producers to export their goods and sell them on the European market. But if these foreign producers want to sell on the European markets, want to export their goods and sell them on the EU market, they have to abide by the same rules as domestic production. And this really gives the EU a lot of power to shape, of course, the products that are being sold on the EU market, but also to shape the rules governing those goods that come into the European market. This is often called the EU's economic power in that sense. But by extension, because foreign or producers operating on global markets often don't like to adhere to different standards, they tend to, or in many cases have adopted EU standards for their global production. So they will not only apply the same standards to products sold on the EU market, but also to other markets in the United States or China or globally as such. And this is what has been often referred to also as the EU's regulatory power, also called the Brussels effect, where foreign companies adopt EU standards on a global level. And an extension of that, also other countries have in some instances adopted EU rules because of pressure from their domestic producers exporting to the European Union, because of course they have an incentive that other producers in their home country are subject to the same rules as well. For a long time, this has been more sort of a byproduct of internal EU regulation. A very common example is the General Data Protection Regulation, where data protection rules have been adopted by Facebook and many other big companies at a global level, because they don't want to adhere to different standards in different jurisdictions. But under the European Green Deal, and in more recent times, given the more competitive geopolitical international context, the European Union has tried to use this market or regulatory power more consciously, and especially under the European Green Deal has adopted conscious policies aiming at production outside the EU to sort of make sure the global markets are shaped in the way the European Union prefers it, in this case a more environmental, climate-friendly way, such as in the case of the CBAM.
Mm-hmm. That's quite interesting that, okay, the EU has like all of this economic power, like the internal markets, like that's what you think of first, you know, like that's really the power why it can do these things. But then I think it's also quite interesting that just by making regulation, and for countries it's easier to just follow the same regulation like everywhere or the same standards, that then also more indirectly it can also like influence companies and other countries as well. Then maybe building onto this and focusing a bit more on CBAM specifically, how do these third countries actually respond to the EU saying like, oh, now you're going to pay a price if you want to export your goods like to the EU, where before they didn't have to do it?
Actually, we've seen a lot of international reactions to the EU CBAM, and in my latest research, I try to systematize this and analyze this a bit more systematically. And to do so, I mapped political reactions of 32 countries, including the major global emitters and economies, but also the EU's main trading partners and some developing countries, all of those countries having a relevant trade that will be affected by CBAM in the future. And at a conceptual level, I distinguish between three different types of reactions other countries can have. They can oppose the CBAM, sort of with the aim to try to get the EU to retract or change their CBAM. They can seek a cooperative solution to sort of try to get an exemption from the CBAM or try to change it as well. And then finally, they can adopt domestic policies to mitigate the impact of the CBAM on the domestic economy, for example, by adopting a carbon price. Here it's important to know that the CBAM will take into account a carbon price paid in the country of origin. So if a country A already has a carbon price, it will only have to pay the difference to the EU's carbon price. So here, if a country adopts a carbon price, it will collect those revenues domestically rather of sending them to the EU. So in all the countries I studied, I observed a wide range of these reactions. And interesting, all countries studied have shown at least one reaction, and around 2/3 of them have shown more than one reaction. So let me just quickly walk through the different observations I've made there across the three categories I distinguish. First, about opposition. Opposition was quite a common response. About 2/3 of countries have shown opposition in some way or the other. What I found surprising there was that opposition was less hard than expected. So I distinguish between different types of opposition: hard options such as sanctions or taking the EU to the WTO to challenge it, to challenge the CBAM in front of international trade law. But none of these countries I studied has made use of these options yet. But so far they've only employed what I call political opposition. So basically complaining or challenging the EU CBAM in a verbal way through political declarations at international institutions, but basically just expressing their discontent and their dissatisfaction with the CBAM as such. And there especially other countries criticize that it distorts trade, that it's protectionist and against international climate and trade law, but also they're generally against the idea that the EU regulates productions or anything outside its own borders. What is also interesting there that it sort of has calmed down. So when the CBAM was first introduced in 2019, all countries were very vibrant, very strongly opposing the CBAM on basically principal matters. And now over the past years, especially since it's become more clear how the CBAM looks like, the criticism has sort of become more specific, talking about implementation issues and implications of the CBAM for targeted countries. And then also countries that are very close to the EU and already have a carbon price, such as the UK or Canada, have not really strongly opposed the CBAM as well. So I also found that an interesting observation. Moving on to cooperation, this was around a third of countries. It came in many forms. We had some bilateral cooperation to try to make sure domestic policies are accounted to under the CBAM. There was a lot of bargaining attempts to sort of try to get exemptions from the EU, especially by India and the US, but they were not successful. And then finally, some countries have asked for support from the EU to implement domestic measures. And then finally, the one I found most interesting is policy adoption, where actually we saw some sort of policy adoption in 2/3 of the countries studied, out of which for 15, I could observe a clear link to the EU CBAM, where in some way or another countries have said, we adopt this policy or we change our policy in response to CBAM. And you could see that on the one hand at the domestic level, where they're implementing domestic carbon pricing options to sort of, as mentioned before, reap those carbon prices domestically rather than going to the EU. But you also had several countries that are now talking about introducing their own CBAM to address issues of carbon leakage domestically as well. These are generally industrialized countries that already have a strong carbon price. So to sum up, I think the CBAM has had like a very big impact on the international discussion when it comes to carbon pricing and climate action. So you can already see that this implicit aim to drive climate action globally already has sort of manifested over the past years, even though it's not even fully enforced yet.
Mm-hmm. So really, at the start, perhaps it ruffled a lot of feathers when it was implemented, or was going to be implemented, and people weren't so happy about it. But now, you know, like more nuance or different types of discussions are happening around it, where I think in a positive way, also actually some more climate measures are being taken, then hopefully so we can all together move to a better world. Of course, more recently, there's been a lot of geopolitical shifts, perhaps, or a lot of, as people refer to it, turbulence or things happening in the world. Does this have an impact, or do you think this will have an impact on CBAM and its implementation as well?
I think that's a very good and very interesting question. I think you can look at it domestically and internationally. At the domestic, so the EU level, one of the interesting things about CBAM in this context is that it's actually a protectionist measure, sort of trying to level the playing field of domestic production and global production, and protecting domestic production that wants or needs to do more climate action from competition from abroad. So in that sense, it actually already very well fits this narrative of the EU becoming a more geopolitical actor and also trying to shape global rules as they are. And then more at the current political level that we have going on with the Clean Industrial Deal, there was actually a form proposed by the CBAM, which would sort of lower the amount of companies or targeted from the CBAM that would actually have to apply the CBAM rules and pay the carbon price. So they introduced the Commission proposed to introduce a threshold that would essentially exempt 90% of CBAM importers, which sounds like a lot, but the Commission says that it would still cover 99% of emissions that are imported through CBAM sectors. And you could see this as a way of the Commission responding to a lot of calls about implementation issues, and there's a lot of administration involved with CBAM implementation, but also as a way to sort of prepare CBAM to be expanded to other sectors, so to make CBAM even bigger and expanding the global reach of CBAM maybe in that sense as well, which is something the Commission has very openly hinted at it's planning to do as well in the near future. And then internationally, of course, the CBAM, being a very unilateral and quite provocative measure, of course, contributes to turbulent times. You can see there's a lot of opposition, and we will have to see how other countries will keep reacting to CBAM, if they maybe have more stronger opposition reactions in the future. So we will have to continue observing actually how the CBAM will play out now that it's also coming into force and the carbon price is being phased in from the next year onwards. But also the CBAM, I think, can be a driver of international climate action. We already talked domestically about it driving climate policies at a domestic level in other countries, by other countries adopting carbon pricing policies. But also I think it can be a driver of international climate policy, especially if more and more countries adopt CBAMs, as is being discussed in several countries. This would sort of incentivize other countries even more to adopt domestic carbon prices, and then might be a stepping stone for an international solution to address the issue of carbon leakage, which hasn't really been effective in the past years as well.
I think that's interesting as well that, a lot of times when we talk about turbulence, it's almost like something that happens to the EU, like everything that's happening. But of course, what the EU does is also a source of turbulence for others as well, and will also create a little bit to, like this changing or like evolving times. But I think it's good to hear that at least it can be like a force for good in creating some stable commitments for climate action in the future as well. So let's see what happens there. I think this goes nicely into my last question, which I would like to ask, which I always like to ask my guests, which is, what gives you hope for the future, just like in general, when you're not doom scrolling or anything else?
Yeah, I think besides all the policy developments that I'm looking at as part of my job, I think one thing that always gives me hope and makes me have a more positive outlook is the small and bigger actions around the world done by many, many individuals, but also companies, also done by governments, that sort of try to address global challenges, especially climate change, but also others, and sort of trying to make the world or a bit of better and safer place for everyone step by step. So it's a long journey, but I think there's many people pushing in the right direction, and I think that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of what we sometimes see as like small actions or small projects that are happening, of course, still always have an impact and can inspire others.
Exactly.
So thanks a lot. And I hope that this big project of CBAM will also inspire then other countries to also take big projects. But let's see what the future brings. And thanks for coming on the show and sharing all your insights with us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal-net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.